Hello, everyone, and welcome to Road to Reason. I'm Rick Wingrove. My co-host today is Larry Mendoza, and we have as a guest today Catherine Dunphy, the Executive Director of the Clergy Project. Catherine, let's jump right in. What is the Clergy Project?
The Clergy Project is an online forum and sanctuary for non-believing, atheist, agnostic, humanist, free-thinking, active and former clergy persons. So priests, rabbis, nuns, pastors, ministers, imams, you name it.
And this is for people who are in the pulpit, preachers, and they're like who find themselves not believing what they're selling.
Exactly. We have, in our membership, we have about 80% that are former clergy persons. So the remainder are actives that are in the pulpit or at the, leading a congregation as we speak. So yes, indeed, we have many active members around the world.
And how many active members do you have?
Right now we have about a little over 100 and so close to about 120 active members. And the remaining members, our total membership is, today I checked, about 460. So every day we get updates because we're doing continuous rolling screening for new applications.
How often do you guys get applications in?
It depends. Interestingly enough, we tend to get a lot of applications around Easter. It's the season. A lot of people have difficulty continuing to talk about the resurrection, or zombie Jesus, as we like to refer to him
Right.
on the forum. And so they reach out because that is a time of need for them.
Now, my first exposure to this, my first time I heard of it was a year ago at the American Atheist Convention, which was up in Maryland. And I was mentioning before the show that usually when I go to the atheist conventions, I like to see the science stuff or hang out in the bar. But for some reason, I stayed in to watch this, and it was the most moving thing I've ever seen at an atheist convention. We watched Teresa McBain. I hope we'll talk some more about her, but we watched an actual preacher, active preacher in Florida, basically end her career on stage because she was an atheist. She had come to this realization that she was an atheist and could no longer carry on, preaching from the pulpit.
Yeah, it's a very difficult position to be in, to be responsible for articulating values that don't resonate with you, that you feel to be false, and that you feel to be destructive in your own life and in the lives of those around you. So yes.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it's hard enough for just members of these churches to come out. I've had friends that left the church and have had a really hard time coping with the loss of support, family, friends, community, a sense of community and belonging. So I can only imagine how hard that would be for leaders of the churches to do this.
I would say that the impact of coming out as an atheist is probably the number one for the family and their extended community, is the number one deterrent for our members, because in the wake of that realization, you have to be considerate of the people that matter to you. And it impacts greatly those relationships. I know many members who have lost spouses. They no longer have family members that will speak to them. There continue to be terrible interpersonal conflicts. So yeah, it's very troubling that changing your mind, that thinking, that making a decision would so radically jeopardize your happiness and well-being.
One of the things that struck me about this was that when you're a preacher, and I know this is certainly true in the Southern Baptist communities I grew up in, when you're the preacher, there is a social hierarchy involved with that. And you are, in some communities, you're the president, the king, the top dog, whatever, and your wife is the first lady of that group. You're top of the social pyramid. And when I can only imagine what it's like to be in the pulpit, and you've come to this realization at some point, and you know that not only do you have to quit the only thing you know how to do, you then have to go out in the world and find some way, or carry on just being just an amazing hypocrite, I suppose.
Well, I mean, that's definitely, it's a really unique challenge, because when you're when you're primed to be this religious leader, you really don't know anything else, and many of our members only have degrees in theology, some from accredited universities, but many from the evangelical tradition that are not from that are from Bible colleges.
So these are clearly not stupid people.
No, they're not. They're
dumb.
definitely not. They're thinking people. That's part of the reason. And many members who are now atheists, they got that way because they were trying to be better apologists. And so they thought that one of the ways to strengthen those abilities was to read Dawkins, was to read Hitchens, to look at those criticisms and to deconstruct them.
Huge mistake.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens to a lot of these people.
Yes.
And a lot of them never get exposed to some of this other literature. And it's not just even Dawkins and Hitchens and some of these authors, but also at least in the evangelical side of things, the fundamentalists, a lot of these guys thought they have a slam dunk case against evolution. So what they do then is they start to read a little bit more about it, and then all of a sudden they realize, wait a minute, we don't have the full story. So that does happen. But I have a quick question for you. Do you think, or do you know, or have any data on the effect that clergy members leaving these churches, and at least the ones that are out, are they having any effect on their congregations? Is it maybe getting some of the people to start thinking a little bit more about maybe they are questioning their faith?
Well, we're not capturing that data right now, but it is something that we want to be able to capture more data moving forward. We have incidental information based on some of our members who have transitioned congregations. I'm thinking specifically of Mike House and the Houston Oasis, where Mike, as you might remember, shortly after the Reason Rally last year, came out on MSNBC, and some of his congregation migrated with him away from that church into the Houston Oasis. But that takes a lot of skill, and it takes a lot of time and prep for the congregation. We have another member in Canada who has been successful in migrating a Christian congregation. She did lose members of her congregation, but she's also gained members from that are humanists. And so her congregation is actually mixed. There are some people who identify as being Christian, but the majority identify as being humanist or secular humanist or atheist or agnostic. And so it's nice to see that these persons with varied opinions can put those aside and come together for the community aspects of it.
Wonderful, yeah.
It also shows that there's a huge untapped reservoir of people who are not quite as evangelical or as committed to religion as they would like for us all to believe.
Yeah, it is interesting to think that, well, what are the core components that make these communities successful? Is it necessarily this book of scripture? Is it necessarily this moral code that is supposedly come down from on high? And I don't think that that's the case. I think it's the community. I think it's the interaction and the engagement that they feel, a place to be listened to and a place to matter.
Yeah. You mentioned spouses also.
Yes.
And talking to some of the people who have started themselves on this journey or have arrived at this place. And as far as being the first lady, they find that the spouse is not always on the same journey that they're on. And I can imagine the stress that causes in a marriage. Well, we know there are numbers.
Yeah, there are definite numbers on that, and I mean I know from talking to my brothers and sisters in the Clergy Project that yes, they face those very challenges. That there have been many divorces because of this change in worldview, this change of opinion,
And social status.
and social status.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes me feel very sad, not just for the individual who is, the member of the Clergy Project who's lost the relationship, but also for the other partner, because they've allowed something so intrinsically insignificant to dictate their happiness and the fabric of their family and the relationship that they identified as being something that they held so dear. So.
Tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you, come about?
Well, I was raised a Roman Catholic and was raised pretty much as the child for God. There's this history in Catholicism and certain Catholic families that you have a child that is for God. And so when I was very young, I said I wanted to be a nun. I actually found myself at 18 on the doorstep of a convent, talking to the Mother Superior, who was a very dear friend of my family's. And she recommended that I first study theology before I make any commitment to any congregation. So that's what I did.
Smart move.
It was very smart, and I don't think that she would really have articulated that if she realized that at the other side of it I would end up an atheist. But I see that as a wonderful piece of advice.
Sure.
So I went and studied theology as an primary undergraduate institution, and I really loved it. I loved the biblical criticism. I loved the serious theology, the scholarship portion of it, but I also loved the social justice issues of it. So that's why I decided to go and do my Master's of Divinity, and I wanted to work as a chaplain in palliative care and also to teach later on. So that was the next step. But I was very informed by liberation theologies, particularly feminist liberation theology, and all of that helped me to deconstruct the Christian paradigm and to realize that I was the architect of its design.
Can you describe maybe to our viewers what liberation theology really is and how it differs from other?
Liberation theology is a social justice theology, and it emerged out of El Salvador and a Roman Catholic priest by the name of Oscar Romero. He's kind of seen as the father of liberation theology, and it is this radical idea that the poor matter, that the marginalized matter,
It is
that the
radical.
voiceless
What a radical
have a
idea.
voice. And so that really resonated with me because I like social justice issues, and I
Sure.
like to see that there is justice and there's hope for the marginalized.
You know, you would think if the poor mattered, Jesus would have said something about that.
Yes.
Oh, wait.
Indeed, indeed. So many proponents of liberation theology say that it is a truer articulation of Jesus' vision of Christianity than, say, the Catholic oligarchy.
So somewhere between your enrollment in seminary and graduation, you
Yes.
became an atheist. How
I
awkward
did.
was graduation?
Very, very, very awkward. It was even more awkward to write my thesis, where I concluded that nihilism, as a woman, nihilism is a more preferential viewpoint than to be a Roman Catholic, because in either stance you're kind of backed up against the wall with no place to move, but at least you're in a room where no one hates you.
Interesting, yeah. Nietzsche over Jesus, I see.
Yes, yeah.
You know, one of the other things that I happened on there at last year's conference, Richard Haynes of Atheist Nexus. I was actually in a room with Richard Haynes of Atheist Nexus, Ernest Pierce, who is a former preacher, and I think one of your early members,
Yes.
and Jerry DeWitt.
Yes.
And first I watched these three guys have a scripture battle, which was just hilarious. It was surreal. And it's on tape somewhere. A guy named Reep Payden has that on. I hope we can get some of that
Yeah,
footage
that'd be
someday.
excellent.
But it was hilarious. But Richard Haynes talked about the fact that he was the first person in his family to find Jesus. And he was very adamant, and he managed to drag his whole family into the church. And then he found out that he was an atheist. He figured out that the gods were not real and all that implies. And so he's out, and his whole family's still in the church, believing where he led them.
Yes.
Again, awkward moment.
Awkward moments.
Yes, yeah, indeed. I would say that most of the members of the Clergy Project came from religious families, and by and large, their families are still religious. There are some members that had spouses that changed their minds as well, and they're the few. They're
the
definitely
minority,
the
yeah.
minority. But it is a constant, I wouldn't say battle, but it's somewhat of a battle to maintain a safe place to have a relationship with a family member that is still of that particular religious persuasion, because you have to call a truce and adhere to it, and sometimes that is tricky to navigate.
Sure, sure. And I would imagine if the family members were secular or atheists, and they were the only ones like that were religious, leaving that religion probably wouldn't be so difficult, and these people probably wouldn't come to a place like the Clergy Project, I would imagine. But You know, but even still, with these people coming to the Clergy Pride, they're contacting you guys or sending in, I guess, is there an application process, I would imagine?
Yes,
Or
yeah, we have a very thorough screening process,
Okay.
and it's only been up and running for a little over a year. Prior to that, all our applications were screened by either through Dan Barker or Linda Lascola. And Linda and I actually worked together on creating the screening process and making sure that it was stringent enough so that we weren't vulnerable to spies.
Sure,
Right.
So we were
right,
cognizant of the
yeah.
fact that people would want to infiltrate the group. And so I don't really talk about the steps that we take in the
should
application
you.
process.
Nor should
but
you, right.
but we do have, if members of the public are interested, they can go to the website and see that there is an application
Sure.
process. Please don't apply if you don't meet the criteria, but because we have a group of volunteer screeners that are responsible
Sure.
for speaking to and connecting with all of these applicants.
This is not just a club. This isn't
No.
just a feel-good group.
No.
You're helping people make a major transition in their lives
Yeah.
and to be able to find jobs.
Yeah, well, we started as a peer support group, right? And that is still primarily the function because it's very important and to have a place where you have peers.
Sure.
And it's hard to find peers when you're a religious leader who doesn't believe in God. You know, so it's wonderful to just be able to say something and everybody just kind of get it and not have to make an explanation. But yes, we've been working, we've been growing. We recognized pretty much from the very beginning that we needed to have resources, but with a limited budget and with really just a group of 50 people at the beginning, we you know. And who we didn't know everybody's
Sure.
identity, and I still don't know people's identity.
Sure.
There's anonymity and privacy on the site, and people's identities are protected. But how do you help to improve their situation? How do you help them to get out of ministry if that's
Right.
what they want to do? And so recently we received a donation from Todd Stifel and the Free Thought Foundation, and of $100,000, and we have a program where it's basically an employment prep program that helps the clergy person assess their skills, look at what's transferable in a secular job, update their resume, and then help them to connect with jobs. There's no guarantee of employment because no organization or agency will guarantee that. But it is a very important step at helping our members to actually see, hey, these skills that I have in ministry are
Can be
applicable
used, yeah.
in many, many different professions and can be utilized in a number of different ways. And I am marketable outside of this role.
Well, to be a religious leader, you got to be somewhat personable. You got to have some of those soft skills that a lot of jobs require. So I can imagine.
Yeah,
it's
indeed,
pretty.
indeed.
What kind of jobs are you transitioning them into?
Well, you know, some of our members have skills in psychology, for example. So some members have gone on to careers as therapists or in social work.
Interesting.
Others have had interest in communications or writing or public relations. In the example of Teresa McBain, some are interested in music or television production. So wherever they might have these secondary skills that weren't explored, some individuals might want to go back to school. So we want to have the opportunity to be able to do some educational grants, but that's going to require some fundraising. And there has been talk about internships for our members in other secular organizations, and I like that idea because it's bridge building.
Sure,
you know,
sure.
but it's also would give our members an opportunity to have experience in the secular world and within a secular organization,
Right.
but more importantly, outside of the church.
Outside
right?
the church.
So, and then they could build their network. And if I see that more likely being a better fit for an individual who wants to become an atheist activist, which would be wonderful and transformative for them as a person but also I think for the atheist community at large.
Absolutely.
Right, I know
agree.
Teresa McBain came out and went to work immediately for American Atheists as a
Yes.
communications director.
Yes.
It's not always that those kind of jobs aren't available for everybody
Yes.
out there. Some
Yeah.
people have to get real jobs.
Yes.
Support families.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I think that's the other deterrent is how are you going to support your family?
Exactly.
Because yeah, though, we're a very egalitarian community, as you might suspect, because considering we're all free thinkers and atheists, and we have a woman at the helm. But most of our members, 86% are male, right? So, yeah, they have families, and because they were, many of them were in more traditional churches, they have more traditional roles, right? So, we do see that as a big issue for our members who want to transition out and to find secular employment. It needs to be sustainable, and it has to be at a similar or close level to what they were making in the church.
Sure, right. Are there any other, we talk about networking and jobs, placement, sense of community. Are there any other specific projects? I mean, you mentioned the educational grants. Is there anything else you guys are doing?
We've been collaborating also with the American Humanist Association around creating a quick access route for our members to become celebrants. And that took a bit of negotiation, but now basically our members send me their application, I send it off to them. They're celebrants.
Interesting.
So the model may change in the future, and I would hope that members of the Clergy Project might be able to take on roles as humanist chaplains, considering we have the theological training necessary to be a chaplain.
Right.
So we would be easily seen as an equivalent in, say, a university or a hospital, or maybe at some point in the military.
Right. So you've been in business for 2 years, I guess you could say.
Yes.
And you survive 100% on donations.
100% on donations.
If somebody wanted to donate, how would one do that?
Well, right now we're still filing with the IRS for our 501c3 status, and the Richard Dawkins Foundation and the Freedom from Religion Foundation have both created accounts on our behalf.
And they were early, strong
They're
supporters.
early, strong
Got you
supporters.
going.
Yeah, I have to underline how important their support was, and that the founders of the Clergy Project were actually atheist leaders.
Sure.
Because they saw that we existed, even though us at the individual level didn't know that we existed as a group. So it was Richard Dawkins and Dan Barker in Conversation, and then Daniel Dennett and Linda Lascola with their groundbreaking study on preachers who are not believers. And also, I'd be remiss to not mention Elizabeth, because Elizabeth Cornwell, because she has been such a proponent and strong supporter, and has so embraced the project and done whatever she can to help us to succeed. And it is because of them.
And she would be part of this conversation,
Yes.
except we literally dragged you out of the Women in Secularism
Yes.
conference in D.C., and she was the last speaker. So
Yeah.
she's still down there as far as we know.
Yeah, she's still down there.
Exactly. So these individuals have made it possible for us to exist. And they are continuing to help support us by accepting donations on our behalf until we're able to do that.
So if anybody would like to donate, just go to the Richard Dawkins Foundation website or the Freedom from Religion Foundation
Or the
website.
Clergy Project.
Or the
Or you
Clergy
can go
Project.
to our
Okay.
website, clergyproject.org, and you can follow the links
Oh, okay.
how I can contribute.
Good.
Right.
Wonderful.
So there are no chapters or anything. It's all centrally
Right now,
run at this point.
Yes.
And so where's the future going to go?
that's a good question, and I mean I'm thinking that way. I would like to see this be a larger, sustainable organization, because we have members all over the world. A great portion are in the United States, and a good portion are evangelicals. But we have imams. We have a member in Tunisia. We have a member in Egypt. We have India, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, Ireland, throughout Europe. So throughout Central America, Brazil, and South America. So yes, we have members everywhere. At
And
some
I think
point,
we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, too.
yes. I agree with you, and I think every member of the Clergy Project would say the same thing, because when we all got together and started talking, we all sat in this kind of moment of, wow, if we were here and didn't know that we were here, then there are others that are in
Sure.
the same position, but they have not felt that they had the ability to speak about it.
It's like, I think most people who arrive at atheism, I think that last step They were actually at much earlier, but saying the word for the first
Yes.
time in relation to themselves is hard. And
It-
I've known people that way.
It is, and I'm going to tell you a small funny story about that for me personally. The first person that I think I articulated that I was an atheist outside of my personal relationship with my husband was Sam Harris.
He spotted you before you spotted you.
Well, no, I was working at a conference in the public relations department that he was partaking in, and I went up to say, I really enjoyed your presentation, and by the way, I'm just graduating, or just graduated with my Master's of Divinity, and he looked a little puzzled at first, and then I said, but I'm an atheist. So I was a little scared to say that out loud at that moment,
Sure.
but because it was a full acknowledgement,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm saying it to an atheist
Right,
spokesperson.
exactly. You're saying to an atheist spokesperson. By the way.
Had you used the word in relation to describe yourself prior to that?
Not really. I said that I didn't really believe anymore, and I just left it up to people to draw their own conclusions, that I left the church, and that just leaves the door open to whatever interpretation you would want. So,
Right.
so yeah.
Is that tough on, once you, I guess, started to become open and admitted, was that tough on the family? And
It continues to be
continues to-
an issue,
Yeah.
mostly with my mother, just because she thinks that I will
come back.
come back.
Yeah.
Yeah, she thinks I will
Sure.
recant,
Sure.
and I don't.
You're going through a phase.
I'm going through a phase, yeah, and it saddens me, but at the same time, we very carefully maneuver those boundaries
Sure.
between us so that we can sustain our relationship. And so I really do acknowledge how much effort she puts into that, because I've seen through other members of the Clergy Project that doesn't always happen.
Right.
Right. Sometimes parents who are more advanced in age, there's just almost no point in springing something harsh like that
Yeah.
on them.
It indeed, and you kind of have to pick your battles, and you don't want. The other thing that I think I want to really make clear is that even though we're this group of atheist religious leaders, we don't deconvert anybody.
Sure. Right.
Not other clergy persons. We don't engage in that type of thing, and we don't do it with our family members either, because we see it as this was our own individual thought process. Pretty much everybody who's an atheist kind of got there on their own, and if you want to get there, then you get there. If you don't, then you don't.
Sure.
You know, we've only got about 30 seconds left. We could go much longer. This is just an
Yes.
amazing subject and just all that it implies. But we're going to have to stop now. We're going to take a little break and bring in Rob Boston as our next guest. So
Thank you for coming.
thank you for coming, and look on the website and donate, contribute, because this
Thank
is important. So.
Body language. Without saying a word, it can tell you so much. Like someone is having a stroke. Know the sudden signs. Learn fast. F, face drooping. A, arm weakness. S, speech difficulty. T, time. Time to call 911 immediately. The sooner they get to the hospital, the sooner they'll get treatment. And that can make a remarkable difference in their recovery. Learn the body language, the sudden signs, and spot a stroke fast.
Don't look at me. Your hair's a bit frizzy today. Aww. You should pick that up.
Every day, kids witness bullying.
For you.
They want to help, but don't know how. Teach your kids how to be more than a bystander. Visit stopbullying.gov.
When I have an asthma attack, I feel scared. Sometimes my parents have to take me to the hospital. I feel like a fish with no water.
You know how to react to their asthma attacks. Here's how to prevent them. Call 1-866-NO-ATTACKS. Visit www.noattacks.org or call your doctor. Because even one attack is one too many.
The average text takes your eyes off the road for nearly 5 seconds.
Welcome back. I'm Rick Wingrove. We've changed some personnel while we were gone. My co-host now is Rob Penzak, and we have with us today Rob Boston of Americans United, a senior policy analyst at Americans United. Rob, you got some books in front of you.
I do. Well, in addition to being a policy analyst there and working there for 25 years, Rob's written 3 different books. The one that we're going to talk about today is Why the Religious Right is Wrong, about separation of church and state. There's a couple others here: Close Encounters with the Religious Right, Journey to the Twilight Zone of Religion and Politics, and The Most Dangerous Man in America, Pat Robertson and the Rise of the Christian Coalition. Now, Rob, I only had a chance to tip these over here. I only had a chance to really go through this one, Why the Religious Right Has It Wrong. I found this a fabulous book. I've only been in the secular community and atheist community for maybe a year or so, and I've been trying to find my footing and learn a whole bunch of stuff about separation of church and state, what our founders really believed about religion, what they intended to do with the Constitution. And so I've been scrambling around and reading lots of different stuff. And this book really was spectacular, that it bundled everything that you need to know into one place. And maybe you can tell us, what exactly were you trying to accomplish with this? I know for me it was really useful.
Well, I was actually trying to bundle everything you need to know into one place. So I'm glad to hear you say that worked for you. Yeah, the idea of that book was to take some of the issues of separation of church and state, some of the history, and some of the important legal rulings in that area, and distill them in a way that they were accessible to the lay person. Now, I'm not an attorney. My background is journalism, and what I found when I started working at Americans United was that most of the material out there that was sort of an introduction to separation of church and state was written by somebody maybe in the academic community or the legal community. While it had a lot of good research, it wasn't really accessible to the average reader. So the first edition of that book actually came out in 1993. That's the second edition, which was 2003. And the idea was to just take some of those issues, get them into everyday language, so people could have a primer on the separation of church and state, both the history and the law. And then from there, the book does contain other works you might want to go on to if you need or interested in a more in-depth treatment. There are those types of works that are available.
Right, I noticed one of the interesting things, you have a Reverend, Lynn I think his name was, but you have a Reverend that wrote the introduction to your book, and maybe you can tell us kind of why that's relevant, that separation of church and state isn't just an atheist issue. We really need religious people involved, and the separation of church and state really serves all the religions out there too. It's not just protecting my rights.
Right, exactly. One of the things that I'm interested in seeing us do is sort of get back to the spirit of the original creation of the separation of church and state, which was an incredible partnership between religious people and what you might call unconventional religious thinkers, maybe free thinkers might be a term to use. You had people like Thomas Jefferson, who had a very deistic view of religion and was certainly not an Orthodox Christian. Jefferson believed in the great moral teachings of Jesus, but didn't believe in his divinity, didn't believe in the Bible and the miracles and that sort of thing. He teamed up with people like John Leland, who was a fiery Baptist preacher in New England, who demanded religious liberty through the separation of church and state. So you had this incredible partnership of a sort of a more unorthodox thinker and a Christian, and I want to see us invoke that spirit again today. So Barry Lynn, who wrote the introduction to my book, is a Christian minister. He's the executive director of Americans United for separation of church and state. And we need to be working on that, bringing in the religious individuals, whether they're Christian or from some other religious denomination, partnering with secularist, atheist, humanist, whatever term people prefer, to work together to support the separation of church and state. That's the historic model, and we need to keep at it.
And of course, having a minister as the head of the organization just adds a legitimacy that shows that it's not strictly an atheist rant of some kind. This is built into our Constitution. It's in the fabric of our Constitution. And having an actual minister, who's also, by the way, a lawyer, has a degree in law, as I recall, just adds that legitimacy to it.
Absolutely, Rick. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book was debunk some of the claims of the religious right about separation of church and state. And one of their most common claims is that it was really all just a plot foisted on us in the modern era by non-believers, atheists, agnostics, humanists, whatever, that was never the intention of the founders. The separation of church and state was not the intention. So I go back, look at the history, debunk that claim, and point out, as I mentioned a moment ago, that the separation of church and state was brought to us by this really phenomenal partnership of religious and unconventional thinkers, and that we need to be bringing that to bear again today to defend that wall that Jefferson so eloquently spoke of.
Right. Separation didn't happen in a vacuum. It was already widely discussed in those days, and you know, the founders with a clean sheet of paper said, you know, let's keep religion separate. And it was probably the most brilliant thing they did in the Constitution.
Well, I think one thing we have to remember is that the founders, first of all, were informed by the European experience, which was combinations of church and state for many centuries.
Yeah, and the Inquisition was last week for those guys.
Right, exactly.
You know?
War, violence, terror. You know, they didn't just, I mean, they read about these things, but they also experienced them. Also, remember this, it wasn't just Europe. Our own country had these examples of intolerance. You know, the Salem witch trials and some of the colonies prior to the Revolution had laws that stated that public office could only be held by certain types of Christians, or that there would be an established church in a certain area. Everybody had to support it, whether they belonged to it or not. In fact, it was the struggle to disestablish the Church of England and Virginia that led Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to become such strong advocates for separation of church and state. They saw men in prison for no other reason, and they preached a doctrine on the street that conflicted with the state-established religion.
You know, one of the things I found really valuable in the book is that it wasn't, you know, in my mind, I usually just think, yeah, they knew about the European tragedy of having religion, but you really brought it home with lots of very clear examples that we had a bunch of mini theocracies here.
Yes, absolutely.
And that the goal of those colonies was not freedom of religion for everybody, it was our way is right, and you follow this, or you'll really be persecuted. And you go through, you know, there were some nasty things that happened to people that didn't want to go along with each individual little colony.
You know, I'm a big fan of James Madison. I mean, Thomas Jefferson's a great figure, but James Madison sometimes gets overlooked. James Madison was sort of the, you know, the intellectual heft of this battle. You know, the father of the Constitution, one of the primary authors of the First Amendment. But before all of that, he was a Virginia resident. And as I said a moment ago, he saw these men in jail, Baptist preachers in Orange County, Virginia, whose only crime was that they had publicly proclaimed this doctrine that the state somehow found offensive. And he wrote to a friend in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania had a little more freedom there, and talked very eloquently about his anger at seeing this happen. The governments really had no right to take sides on theology and to advocate one view over another. And he didn't just, you know, carp about it in a letter to a friend. He brought that change about.
He wrote a remarkable document called Memorial and Remonstrance, if I'm pronouncing that properly, which is probably the most important document I was never taught in school. I never heard of that until maybe 20 years ago. And he spells out, he expounds at length and in detail about the need, the necessity for the separation of church and state.
Right, yes, you're right about the Memorial and Remonstrance. I wish more Americans were familiar with it.
And it's in the book, just to remember, like I said, it's funny because, you know, Rick and Elizabeth are trying to help me find my footing as I learn this stuff. And a lot of the things that you guys talk about are really right here. You know, the Treaty of Tripoli is in here, the letter of Danbury, and the Remonstrance is all in
With
here.
The Remonstrance, I thought the best thing to do would be just to reprint it. I mean, I refer to it several times in the book, so put it in there. It's an incredibly powerful document in the history of religious liberty in America. I mean, essentially what happened is, in Virginia, they were having this big struggle about, you know, disestablishing an Anglican church and what way they would go from there. Patrick Henry, who, you know, was a patriot and an important figure in our history, but one area where he had a bit of a blind spot was church-state relations. He just could not conceive of a government not backed by Christianity. So he advocated strongly for that tie between church and state, and he wanted to pass a bill that would require everyone to pay taxes to support teachers of the Christian religion. And Madison stood up to this. And the Memorial and Remonstrance is essentially just a list of 15 reasons why that was a bad idea, to force people to pay money to support religion against their will. And it's, if you read the arguments today, what's so astounding about them is they ring so true for us today as we fight over things like vouchers for private religious schools, faith-based initiatives, and other attempts to force people to support religion against their will. You could take any one of those arguments by Madison, and it would be relevant to today's arguments.
Well, you know, there's two documents that I point people to when I'm debating people about separation of church and state, which they say doesn't exist. Right. I point them to Jefferson's statute for Virginia statute for religious freedom and Memorial and Remonstrance. These are must-reads. When they say that the founders were ambiguous or didn't really talk about it, that's nonsense. They were very clear on their vision for
Absolutely. I think one of
America.
the biggest mistakes the religious right makes, and believe me, they make many, one of the biggest mistakes they make is they think that they can just debunk one phrase or one letter by Thomas Jefferson, the famous 1802 Danbury Baptist letter where he invoked the wall of separation between church and state. If they can just debunk that, they win. But as you mentioned, it's not that simple. The separation of church and state doesn't come about because Jefferson wrote about it in a letter. It came about from historical experience, informed by personal experience of the founders, put into the Constitution, not in those literal words, but in a concept, growing out in many ways of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And if you don't know that history and you don't understand all of that, obviously the separation of church and state is not going to be comprehensible to you. So the idea is to explain the history to people, and then maybe they'll appreciate what the founders did for us.
Well, one of my favorites, and maybe one of yours too, is when they say, well, those words aren't in there. Those words are not in the Constitution, so there's no separation of church and state. Well, if that's the case, then democracy is not in there either. Capitalism, sure not in there. Job creator is not in there. And all these tax breaks for churches, those aren't in there either. So let's play that game.
There's a late church-state scholar, and I've cited him in the book, named Leo Pfeffer, a famous man who wrote an incredible work on the separation of church and state, but again, more scholarly. He debunked that pretty well, basically by saying, well, the fact that a shorthand phrase like that came along to describe this concept
Shorthand is exactly
is good evidence on our side. The concept was so familiar to people, so necessary and so vital, that this way of describing it came up. Because, think about it for a minute. We could all walk around and recite the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, but those are legalistic phrases. Most people are not going to resonate to that type of language. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Right.
We could say that every time, or we could say separation of church.
Exactly.
One of the things Reverend Lynn points out in there is that you and he both thought that it was very important to fight this battle against the religious right, to arm yourself with facts.
Yes.
Now, we can sit here and talk about the logic, and you can reprint the documents here and say, here's the letter for Danbury, here's the remonstrance. Are people connecting with that? Like, how do you actually get through? Or do you divide? Some people are just never going to want to hear this, and I'm not targeting them. And then it's a middle group that you're sort of going for to try to present the facts in a digestible way and hope that they realize this is their battle too, to the separation of church and state.
You've put your finger right on it, I think. The famous English writer George Orwell once said, there are some people whom you cannot answer. And I think we have to accept that. There are some percentage of people we probably will never reach. But I'm very interested in that much larger middle group that you've talked about. Most people, if you look at these so-called culture wars, as religious right is evoked, and I don't particularly like that term, but it's their phrase. If there is such a thing going on, most folks consider themselves non-combatants. They're somewhere in the middle. And we need to be able to reach them. And I think those individuals are the ones who are open to a good, solid historical and legal argument. And that's why the book is written in a way that the average person can understand it. Every now and then you do encounter someone on the religious right who says, I've changed my views over the years. That does happen. So, it's always good to talk, and it's always good to keep expressing the opinion. But there's a large body of individuals in this country who just haven't maybe thought about the issue as much, and those are the ones we need to be reaching out to.
I think a lot of people just don't look at the information or the arguments ever. A couple of weeks ago, we had some footage on here that I took out in Leesburg. Loudoun County is a bit of a battleground with this. They were having a Bible reading marathon on the county courthouse property there. And I went up and started talking to a guy, and of course, we got talking about the Constitution and the foundation of our laws. He goes, well, our laws are based on the Bible. And I know you've heard it. We always hear it. It's one of the most common arguments in the world. Is that true? Is our legal system based on the Bible?
Well, if it were, I think there'd be some evidence of that, maybe some reference to it by the founders.
In the Ten Commandments specifically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In fact, there was a case a couple years ago my organization was involved in dealing with a judge in Alabama who wanted to put the Ten Commandments in his courthouse. You might remember this because it was a big famous case, Roy Moore.
Roy Moore, yeah.
Some legal scholars and historians put together a legal brief in that case. It was very powerful, in which they basically examined the sources the founders relied upon. And they just didn't find references to the Bible. Instead, there were things like English common law, Blackstone, Locke, Montesquieu. I mean, you can go through a list and say that there were these sources that they referred to a lot more commonly, and that the Bible was really not invoked. That isn't to say that the founders weren't interested keenly in religion, or that they didn't have these discussions, because they did. If you look at their correspondence, you will see there's a lot of discussion about that, a lot of talk about religion. These were intelligent, learned men coming from the elite upper crust of society. They talked about a lot of different subjects, and religion was something that they were very concerned in, but they also knew that it would be dangerous to base government on any one interpretation of the Bible because there were so many of them out there.
Well, you said many theocracies. Every colony was a mini theocracy.
Exactly.
And so your protections in one ended at the border.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's not a sustainable system.
No, I mean, if you were up in New England where the Congregational Church tended to dominate, that was whose clerical thumb you were under. If you drifted south past the middle colonies into Virginia, that was the Anglican Church in the Carolinas and so on. And you just can't find a model like that really works. And there's another sort of facet that's interesting about this too. There were active forms of discrimination against people who did not toe that theological line. They had to pay taxes to support a church they did not belong to.
Exactly.
And if you were a non-believer or a skeptic, well, you have absolutely no rights in some cases. You're probably familiar with provisions that exist in a number of state constitutions that flatly barred non-believers from even holding public office.
And still some provisions on books.
They're still in the books, although they've been nullified by a Supreme Court ruling from the early 60s. But nevertheless, they're still there. But that was the type of active discrimination you had. And sometimes that was even extended to Jews or non-Christians because the idea was that it was some type of a Christian republic. The founders saw all of that. They knew, they were aware of all of that, and they really wanted to just put a stop to, at least at the federal level with the Constitution. And that's why the amendment says what it does.
Right.
You know, in your book, you go through a whole history back even before the Reformation of showing the historical, some ties between church and state, and then the constant conflicts where the popes and the kings are battling, or the emperors battling back and forth to who's going to lead. And then you get to the Reformation, and it's important to remember that, again, all the religious conflict, it's not like atheists are really the big threat to religion. It's the opposing sects that emerged, when people were tired of Catholicism and the taxing and all the things, so they started Protestantism. And those guys weren't any friendlier to the average person. You go through some of the kind of barbaric things that Luther and Calvin, those guys were not good for a lot of the locals unless you towed their very specific line.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I do find that interesting. The religious right these days, to hear them talk and hear their leaders talk, they sort of posit this conspiracy of non-religious people who are trying to tear down the foundations of the republic and totally secularize America, and one hears this constantly. But historically, the conflict in this nation has not been between believers and non-believers. It has been between the competing sects of believers. And they're the ones that are responsible for a lot of the violence and other things that have occurred in the past. That isn't to say there isn't tension between believers and non-believers, because certainly there is some degree of that out there. But historically, it's mainly been Christians against Christians in many cases, or on a larger scale, maybe Christians against Muslims, or different types of fights over the years. But people believing, well, our interpretation of the Bible is absolutely right, therefore we have the duty to impose that on you through the government. Interestingly, in the 19th century, there was a huge battle in this country over religion in public schools. People think of that as a more modern type of a fight. School prayer. Cases go back to the early 1960s. Before those cases came, there was this huge fight in the 19th century, during the time of post-Civil War mainly, because Roman Catholics were being forced to say Protestant prayers in the public schools. And the Protestants were really being obnoxious about it. They were basically doing it as a way to keep down an immigrant group that they didn't like for many reasons. So it was this competing sort of fighting between different Christian denominations in many ways that led some people to so strongly embrace the separation of church and state.
I think it's funny, the modern union with hardline Catholics and the evangelical Protestants that were just tearing each other apart, and now they've realized, at least we should unite for a little while, get our political power, do whatever damage we need, and then we'll go back to hating each other. But for right now, we're a unified bunch.
Yeah, you make a good point in that we were not even part of the conversation back then. We were so oppressed, so closeted, whatever, that we just had no part in that conversation. So yeah, naturally it was which sect was closest to God, which one was the purest interpretation, and everything. And having been brought up in a Southern Baptist tradition, I can say with some authority that everybody who is not a Southern Baptist is going to burn in hell anyway.
Well,
so I'm told.
I was recently doing some research about school prayer because this is the 50th anniversary of the 1963 school prayer ruling.
Right.
I mean, the Township v. Shemp, which is a very important ruling. And when you go back and really look at the history of that battle, it just puts the thing in an entirely different perspective, because you see, as you pointed out a moment ago, all of this arguing between the different Christian denominations. Whose version of Christianity was going to take place in the public school, which was going to dominate? Which version of the Bible were they going to read 10 verses from?
Right.
Which prayer were they going to say? Were they going to let the Catholics omit those words and not have that extra passage, the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, all this kind of thing? It wasn't,
and when is it going to be the Muslims' turn?
right, exactly. It wasn't the case of a rigid desire to secularize schools as much as it was intra-sect fighting between Christian denominations.
Right, and you talked about Abington Township v. Shemp. That was ruled on the same day as Murray v. Curlett.
Yes.
Shemp was the Bible part, Curlett was the prayer part, and they took it out of school. I was in grade school when that happened, and our principal at our school, little school in West Texas, went around to every classroom and explained that things had changed. Up to that day, we had done prayer and Bible reading every day in class. We never did it again, and it immediately disappeared from the Pledge of Allegiance. I was surprised when my daughter went to high school, or to any school, when she was starting grade school, that it was back all of a sudden. God was back in the Pledge of Allegiance when it had disappeared when I was in school.
Well, it's interesting about those rulings. Obviously, Murray v. Curlett, Madeline O'Hare, a famous atheist leader in later years. The Shemp family were Unitarian. But it tends to get overlooked that a lot of Christian leaders did support them. For example, the Southern Baptist Convention didn't used to be as far to the right as they are now. And the Southern Baptists had historically been very supportive of separation of church and state. John Leland, who I mentioned earlier, was a Baptist clergyman. So you had this real strong support from the Baptist community. About the time the religious right began to be a potent political force in America, fundamentalists took over the Southern Baptist Convention and started to reverse their historic stands in favor of separation of church and state. So they went from opposition to a school prayer amendment to supporting a school prayer amendment.
Right.
And unfortunately, moderates have just never been able to break that fundamentalist grip on that denomination. But for many years, they were strongly supportive of my own organization, Americans United. They were involved in the struggle for separation of church and state. And there are still lots of good traditional Baptists we work with. The Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty in Washington is a perfect example of the moderate Baptist belief that still is alive and well in America.
And I've spoken to a number of ministers, just in doing what we do at American Atheists. We talk to ministers all the time who we may disagree on a lot, but we agree on separation of church and state because that's for everybody's benefit.
I think it's a very short attention span that lets us forget that this really is protecting all the sects much more than us. And there's one other thing that you talked about in here that I wanted to get to was you talked about how the religious right kind of brags that on the local level, if they can get 15% turnout, that they can get whatever vote. They can elect all these people into local offices, put people onto the school boards, because there's so much voter apathy or voter ignorance, or just people are busy with their jobs and their lives. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, where on the one hand, there's this huge grassroots religious right, mobilization,
Right.
and then they try to pin it on these tiny amounts of secular humanists are the ones that are running the whole show locally, even though it can't really happen number-wise.
Right, exactly. Well, in this country, we have fairly decent turnout in national elections. I mean, obviously, we're put to shame by some other nations, but it's gotten to a point where it's respectable. But as you go down the level, sort of the state offices and local offices, turnout does tend to drop off. Some years ago, religious right groups realized that if they mobilized people, and a couple of big fundamentalist churches gave them voter guides and sort of instructed them about who to support, they could start getting people onto school boards, local county councils, city councils, and so on, and could really have an impact because there's a lot of decisions that are made at the local level, especially in the public schools. They are subject to local control. So they started to do that, and there was nothing illegal about that except maybe the portion of mobilizing some churches on behalf of candidates. That was a problem. But otherwise, just telling people to get out and vote, that's perfectly acceptable and even laudatory behavior in many cases. So they started to do that, and people woke up and realized that their schools were being subjected to this type of control and fought back, and that battle is still raging in many parts of the country. But you're right, there is this kind of huge religious right myth that they needed to take back the country. They often use that phrase, or take back the country. And I would always ask, well, from whom are you taking it back? Who has it right now? And they would
I think
say,
Rick and I have
you guys
evidently.
you guys got control. You guys control the media, all the government apparatuses, the entertainment industry. It's amazing the power that these
And
folks
don't forget
believe.
the homosexual agenda
Yes,
also.
exactly. Working beside that, you've managed to do this great stuff, and they think the humanists are just running everything. It is a way to spur people to get involved politically and to give money to religious right organizations. It's the enemy du jour.
And of course, we've got them beat down to a mere 75% of the population.
I know, it's
at this
amazing.
point. Yeah, so the oppression is just brutal. Can I say, we got about 3 minutes left or so. You've got another book coming out soon. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, early next year in 2014, my first new book in about 13 years will be out. And the working title of that book is You're Not the Boss of Me: Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give You the Right to Tell Other People What to Do. And I was inspired to write this book in some light of some of the recent battles we've had over things like access to birth control, religious groups saying that they don't have to abide by the law, they don't have to give any recognition or respect to LGBT Americans. I just got tired of these claims being made. You have the right to make your own decisions under religious freedom, decide where you're going to worship, how you're going to worship, but you don't have the right to tell anybody else what to do.
It seems like the Establishment Clause doesn't always work for them, and they tend to think, from what I've seen, that the Free Exercise Clause, they think that this trumps
Yes.
the Establishment Clause and allows them to do whatever they want to, regardless of who else is in the room or their venue. Or
We're going to hear more and more of this. This is the family values for our time. Remember how we used to hear so much about family values
Sure.
in the 80s and 90s? Every issue.
Sure. Still do.
The cry of religious freedom is going to be the next big battle here. What it means, how far it goes, and to what extent it exempts you from following other laws.
Yeah.
Can you talk about freedom of belief versus freedom of action? And I thought that was something to stress that. And you said this one of our very early shows is, my freedom ends where your nose begins. Like you can't go and trample other
Right. Everybody
people's
gets
rights.
free exercise,
Yeah, I
including
mean, you can
atheists.
believe what you want, but obviously there are restrictions on acting. Most states ban snake handling, for example, in churches and other dangerous practices. So the idea that religious freedom is an absolute right, you can do whatever you want under it, that's never been embraced by the Supreme Court, and certainly is not an historical precept.
Exactly.
Can you give us a word or two about kind of the dominionist movement and sort of contrary to the grassroots movement in vast numbers, you can have a very small splinter sect that most religious people are not dominionist by any means, but they have a lot of control over our government.
Can you do that in a minute?
Right, you got a minute and a half.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, the Dominionists are the ones that make the religious right look like liberals. I mean, they're way out there on the fringe. They believe absolutely that there should be biblical law in society, that our government should be based on a literal reading of the book of Leviticus. You'd be executed if you were gay. You'd be executed if you committed adultery. You'd be executed if you committed fornication. Now, that's like 98% of the population right there. So the 2% that are left are going to operate this perfect biblical society and pave the way for Jesus' return.
What does that do to Pat Robertson?
Well, he did have some trouble with that fornication business early on, so he may be on the block as well.
Right. He's turned out to be a never-ending source of entertainment here lately as his mental acuity diminishes, I guess you
Yeah,
could
he
say.
never was exactly Mr. Mental Health, and in later years he's gotten even more interesting.
But even if he declines and he becomes less relevant, I think one of the big points probably in your books is that these people that carry such weight with the religious communities, it can be any random person. If everybody's going to follow them,
no
we're
one
in
should make the
trouble.
mistake of thinking just because one leader becomes less active or passes on or whatever, that the religious right is on the ropes. It's a well-funded, well-organized movement. And unfortunately, I think we're going to be dealing with it for the foreseeable future.
I'm happy to see him keep doing what he does because he's the worst advertisement there is for evangelism in this country.
All right, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, check us out on Facebook and YouTube. We'll see you next time.